Welcome back to the Military Money Manual podcast. I'm Jamie, and today I'm joined by Sam Lewis, the founder of SJL Financial, a Delaware registered fee-only, advice-only RIA. Sam is a CFP, a ChFC, MQFP, and a proud member of the Military Financial Advisors Association. He specializes in helping military families and young professionals build a strong foundation for a secure financial future, a journey he began in 2013 and has continued to develop through his service in the Delaware Air National Guard. With over 26 years of military experience, he currently serves on active duty in a highly coveted AGR position. We'll learn more about that in a second. And today he's here to share valuable insights into key aspects of Guard and Reserve, finances, and life in the service that can support military families in reaching their financial goals. So Sam, welcome to the show. And what is one thing you hope a listener will get out of today's episode?
Thanks for having me on, Jamie. The one thing I really hope to impress upon people, and mainly for your active duty audience, is that your career doesn't have to end when your active duty service commitment is over. If you want to transition into the civilian world, there's a way to stay tethered to the military that can be, rewarding career-wise and also really supplement your family finances. Hopefully today I'll give people some motivation to check those options out if they're considering leaving active duty, or even if they have friends and family and they're not interested in active duty, kind of directed them to the Guard Reserve so they can get that military experience, even if they don't want to do a full-time career.
I wish someone had taught me a little bit more about the Guard and Reserve options when I was younger, but here I am now. And so I'm thinking about the listener who's on active duty, their commitment's coming up. Maybe they're a little disgruntled. They're not happy. They don't like moving all the time. What are a couple things you would talk to them about of just encouraging them to explore some of those options that you just mentioned before we even get into the money side of the Guard and Reserve life?
We have a saying sometimes is that Guard ain't hard. And what I mean by that is a lot of folks on active duty, you kind of turn over a lot of control to big Army, big Air Force, the Marine Corps. Sometimes they tell you what job you're going to do. They tell you where you're going to do it. They might put you on different shifts. Your deployment tempo will probably be pretty robust. I can speak from my personal experience in the Air National Guard, you have a chance to retrain. So maybe you came in maintenance, but your heart is in, medical or communications or cyber. You can retest your ASVAB. And, when you transition to the Air National Guard, you can cross-train into a lot of those other career fields based on availability. For the most part, it is a small time commitment with 48 drill periods per year. That's 4 per weekend. Right now we do what's called a 0-3-3. So some months we don't have drill, some months there are 3 days and so forth. And then annual tours or coming in on annual training days, about 10 to 15 a year. And then, of course, there is the potential for deployments. Those on the Guard side, a lot of times the billets will come down on what they need to fill a deployment requirement, and people will volunteer for them. It's not as likely that you'll be involuntarily sent on a lot of these deployments. Everyone's experience may be different, but and again, the 26 years I've been in Delaware Guard, I can't really recall a lot of times that people were involuntarily sent to deploy. But you also have options to do more duty should you want to, and that's temporary AGR tours. We'll talk a little bit more about AGR later. There are also ADOS tours, active duty operational support. You can volunteer for schools. You can volunteer for deployments. You can volunteer to backfill other units on their deployments. And when I was in college, I did what we refer to as guard bumming. I didn't get a job at, Walmart or McDonald's or the local tire shop. When I needed extra money, I volunteered to come in. And at the time I was at air cargo. So I would, load planes, drive up to the drop zone. They would drop the cargo out of the back. I'd recover the loads, drive it back down to the shop. And it was pretty good money. And a lot of it was just based on how much or how little I wanted to do. And so I got a lot of flexibility. And even so, with us full-timers, most Guard bases work a Monday to Thursday or Monday to Friday schedule during the month. We don't do a lot of weekend work outside of the regular scheduled drill. Not many do shifts outside of firehouse or security police. So, if you're a maintainer and you keep getting stuck on midnights and missing time with your family, that's really probably not going to be your experience in the Guard. It's a ton of flexibility that you might not be accustomed to on active duty. And you really can choose your own adventure to an extent.
So I think one of the things that is attractive to people, you mentioned the flexibility, you mentioned being able to volunteer for deployments. People would do that sometimes for the money, but sometimes because you can still earn an active duty retirement, even when you go to the Guard. You don't have to wait till you're old to collect retirement in all cases in the Guard and Reserve, right? Can you walk us through that?
And so I'm a perfect example of that. So, I joined in 99. I was right in high school, went right to basic training, got back ribbon day for college in the dorms. And so I was a traditional. I lived the college experience. I lived in college dorms. And, 1 week a month, I'd come over for my drill. And, I would come in for additional duty every now and then, work the summers. And I did that for a number of years. And I had a civilian career. And then I enjoyed what I did with the military so much. I came on board as it's called a dual status federal technician. So I didn't get paid according to my rank, but I was a WG worker, wage grade, probably more familiar with like GS, like general service, but kind of the same thing. And then I moved into an AGR billet in 2011. And so now I'm accruing active duty points. And so at 26 years, I could retire today, but I wouldn't collect my pension until I turned 60. None of my deployment time would count for the reduced retirement age. But if I continue to stay until I get 7,300 active duty points, then I would get a regular retirement. And so we'll talk a little bit about points in a little bit, but I kind of have that flexibility of, I've got the golden handcuffs and I want to stay for that. But if I do decide to punch early, it's not going to be like I'm going to miss out on my pension. I've already secured that with 20 years of satisfactory service. But what happens a lot of times are folks come from active duty and they have a ton of points. So you get a point for every day on active duty. And there's a couple other categories you can use to accrue points as well. But you take every year of active duty and you multiply by 365. By the time you transition over to the Guard or Reserve, you've already bringing a ton of points with you. So even if you don't get an active duty retirement in the Guard or Reserve, your Guard or Reserve pension that you collect later is going to be substantially more than the average airman or soldier that has been in the Guard or Reserve their entire career and doesn't have as many retirement points. And that's a very valuable benefit when you're looking at supplementing multiple streams of income into your retirement planning is, so you've got TSP now in your civilian and maybe you have 401k, maybe you've had a Roth IRA or something all along and maybe some rental income or something of that nature. But now you've got this inflation adjusted pension that's going to kick in that can allow you to push off Social Security a little bit longer. Or maybe that security can allow you to reduce your bond exposure a little bit in your retirement portfolio because you have that guaranteed stream of income. It's got a ton of benefits. We have some people that through the Palace Chase or Palace Front program come to us directly from active duty, get into an AGR position, and it's just night and day for them. They can't believe that they're still going to get almost all the same pay benefits that their counterparts on active duty were getting, and they're doing it at a Guard base, and they're not getting PCS'd all the time. They're not working crazy shifts. They've chosen the career they want to be in, and it's really quite a different culture in the Guard and Reserve. But we still go to the same training. We fill the same deployment requirements. I'm sure some active duty listeners are going to have some opinions about, well, we had this Guard unit come and they had maybe a different experience. We deploy according to our rank, our AFSC, and we're in there doing the same job. So I was deployed 2004 to Iraq. There was a gap in there, and I was 25-year-old staff sergeant running a section over there for a while until my active duty counterpart got in theater. And, we all kind of blend together, and it's all one team, one fight.
I can hear the roots of your recruiter background in there a little bit, and I don't want to be pushing that too much. But these are really nice lessons that I think had someone approached me 4 years or 12 years into my commitment, it would have been nice to have a clear understanding of all my options. And I don't think most people will smoothly transition from active duty straight into an AGR position because, like you mentioned, those are kind of coveted. Yeah, I understand in the Air Guard, AGR is maybe a little different than what the Army does, but what's your experience with AGR and how that works for if someone's tired of PCSing, let's say, they love serving, they love their job, and there's a Guard unit in their state, they have the exact same job available, and it's AGR. They could potentially do the exact same job, the exact same pay, and not move.
Like I said, I was drill status guardsman, federal technician, and when I came to the AGR program, the stars aren't always going to align. I didn't have an AGR position in my AFSC, so each state kind of manages those resources a little bit differently. And so I was a master sergeant at the time, and I had to take a stripe off to go into a tech sergeant AGR billet, and that was a calculated risk that I took. But I got into the program, and so again, some AGR units, some reserve units are co-located with an active duty installation. But here in Delaware, we always get confused for Dover, but we're 45 minutes to an hour north of Dover. And that's a great benefit as well because I'm not in panel to Dover or Aberdeen for medical care. So I have TRICARE Prime Remote. I go to civilian doctors all the time, no copay. I share pretty openly. My wife and I, we have beautiful twin girls, really traumatic birth experience for my wife. Kids were in the NICU for 9 days. Wife had emergency surgery. She was in the hospital for 2 weeks. And the entire time, I didn't have to worry about costs. And whatever the doctors recommended, I said, go do it, and just wanted a good health outcome. And when I got the explanation of benefits, it was over $250,000. And I didn't pay a dime for that. And so that was one of the first times it really just struck me how valuable those insurance benefits are. Another great example is a lot of active duty members, if your spouse does work or for whatever your family situation, you need to use the CDC. I've heard varying degrees of satisfaction with those. But again, because I'm not co-located with an active duty base with the CDC, I used a program called Child Care Aware through NACRA. They subsidized me to go to a civilian preschool, or my kids to go to a civilian preschool, I should say. And that was over $500 a month. And when you have 2 newborns in preschool at the same time, you're basically paying half of someone's salary. And so any little bit helps. And again, with the pay and benefits, I still get a lot of the same benefits that you would traditionally associate with active duty. A lot of the same, discounts on credit cards, a lot of the same discounts at, Lowe's and things like that. And they seem very small when you look at them individually, but when you aggregate everything, it really does provide for a great quality of life. And one more thing I want to touch on, because I think you mentioned it a little bit, and this is one of the greatest benefits of AGR service in the Guard Reserve and not having to PCS, is stability. And there's 2 main things I'd like to point out. The first is because I'm serving where I live and I'm not worried about PCSing, the question of do I buy or do I rent because I don't know how long I'll be here was greatly simplified. My wife has her own career. And I did the math. This was a few years ago, so don't hold me to it. I haven't rerun the numbers. But at the time, I looked at our combined total family income and then our after-tax income for me being an E8. And I think at the time, I was like 24 years time in service. My wife, she has her own career and she's doing very well. To the IRS, she makes more, but with my pay, with my allowances, I end up, a little bit ahead. But our total take-home was equal to what an 08 would earn at that time. So if you think about a 2-star general who moves around so much that their spouse is not able to have their own career and all of the stress and everything that has to go into having that kind of military career, we still have the same take home just by virtue of the stability of dual family income because we're not getting moved all around. And the second point, when you have to PCS and you're making that decision about, do I want to buy or rent, you're going to have to live somewhere. And so you're going to have to make a choice. And it might not be the best time for you because the market might be high, interest rates might be high. I bought this house in 2017. I kept my old house. I refinanced both of them when interest rates were in the basement. So I've got a 2.25 on both of those. And let's say I was in active duty and I got PCS to this house today. I ran the math, like it was a little bit of a year ago when interest rates were pretty much at their peak. And it was over 2.5 times the monthly payment, what I'm paying now, because of the valuation of the house at the time and the interest rates at the time. If I were to, take out a new VA loan to buy this house, with no money down, the payment would be, I think 2.5 times what I'm currently paying. I'm not put under that pressure where, you've had other people on your show where they talked about they moved to a new location, they bought a house, the market turned, and now they're in a position where they're underwater and they've got to make that decision to sell. And it's really unfortunate that the system kind of puts service members in that position where they want to build equity, they want to have stable roots, and the needs of the Army or the Air Force or the Navy moves them around so much that there's going to be those situations where maybe they made a great decision when they got to that duty station, but it's not a great decision if they have to move before they're ready to. So those are the two biggest things that I always tell folks is the stability and the ability for your spouse to have a career without being bounced around so much. I may never be a wing commander or anything like that, but I'm doing just fine with being a senior NCO and my wife and kids having the stability to not be kind of at the whim of the government to move us over to, Oconus or to another state. But some people in the Guard do enjoy that, and they do put in for positions at other states. We've hired people in Delaware from all over the country, active duty, other Guard units, reserve, people have come over from the Army. Again, it just goes back to, you have a lot more flexibility and kind of choose your own adventure.
Yeah, or you can volunteer for headquarters tours at a active duty major command or something like that. I saw that a lot when I was in Hawaii. Okay, Sam, I want to ask a couple questions about things that people might be logistically thinking about in their head now if they're intrigued by this idea of transitioning from active duty to the Guard and Reserve. And I'm guessing most of our listeners are on active duty thinking about a transition, not just a direct accession into the Guard. How does something like healthcare work if I go part-time route initially and I can't get an AGR right away?
So if you are a drill status guardsman and not on active orders for 30 days or more, you would be eligible for TRICARE Reserve Select. So you do pay a premium for that. However, if you are moving out into the civilian world, you're going to really have to compare apples to apples because you might get a little bit more of a salary at one employer, but their insurance premiums are a lot higher or their coverage is a lot worse. I worked for an engineering company before I came on full-time with the Guard, and it was this really convoluted cost share structure. And I remember at the time I was earning like $12 an hour. I was right out of college, and I had to get like a CAT scan done on my head or something. And they were, my portion of that was like $800. And that was like 2 months rent at the time. And that was my out-of-pocket expense. Fast forward to today, whenever I need healthcare, it's almost always covered by TRICARE. But that TRICARE Reserve Select is a really good value for your dollars. I don't have the premium schedule in front of me, but you do have access to that. A lot of people do stay in the Guard just for that benefit. They use their other employer benefits, but, it's just not competitive with what TRICARE Reserve Select is. Now, the one caveat I will say to that is if you do come into a dual status technician position and are eligible for FEHB, you cannot use TRICARE Reserve Select. I believe that rule is in effect until 2030 is when they're phasing that rule out to where you could be a federal employee but still get TRICARE Reserve Select if you're eligible due to your military service.
That's interesting. Another one people may worry about is their VA disability. So, I worked hard on active duty, my back, my knees, whatever. I earn a 30% rating. 2 questions. Will that affect my eligibility and my medical readiness for the Guard? And then how does that work? Can I collect VA disability while I'm drilling as a traditional guardsman? Or if I go AGR, can I still get VA disability?
So a few things there. One, we had people transfer to us from active duty or from other states all the time that had VA disability ratings, but they were under retention standards. And that's an important thing to discern is that if you have no break in service, you go right from one component over to us, you fall under retention standards. And they kind of understand as trained assets, you're going to have some bumps and bruises and things like that. So it's not uncommon to have folks come over with, 30, 40% VA disability. While you're in the Guard, if you have things that happen in the line of duty, and let's say you go on a deployment and you bust your knee up or you injure yourself at a school or something like that, you can file a VA claim prior to retirement, start collecting VA disability while you're still in service. However, you cannot collect both the VA disability and military pay for the same periods. So oftentimes what that means is you're going to have to waive one or the other for the periods that you come on military service. Now, most of the time it makes sense to waive your military pay for like the drill weekend. If you're got a higher VA rating, it's not uncommon for us to have people in the Guard. I've run across a few that have 100% VA rating and they drill for points only. So they still collect their entire VA disability check each month, which is, could be close to $4,000. They don't accept their Guard pay, but they get to their 20 years retirement and then they will get their pension at the end. They still collect the points for the service, even if they're not getting paid for those periods. That's a whole deeper topic to dive into. There's lots of nuances there you got to be careful about. But I would say if you come over with a rating for, some knee problems, but you can still do a PT test, probably not a big deal. If you come over with, a lot of substantial problems that you're going to be continually on profile, then the state air surgeon or the medical unit that has to review you might have some questions there and it might necessitate a waiver or something like that. But the one thing that I really caution folks about is there's a window And it's typically 6 months from when you separate, or if you have an entrance or a separation physical, it's a year from there, where if you separate for that period of time and you decide to come back in, you're going to have to go back through MEPS again, and you're going to have to meet accession standards again. And it was 98 when I went through MEPS, and it was a different world. Nowadays, they have access to 95% of your electronic health records through MHS Genesis. You come into the recruiter and they do the same health history questionnaire, and then you have to sign consent for MEPS to pull those electronic health records. And so a lot of the bumps and bruises that maybe you saw a civilian doctor about or wasn't in your military medical records, they're going to have access to that, and that could be a barrier to reentry, which is really unfortunate because I think we've all kind of seen the story of the young airman or soldier who, is leaving active duty. They're sure that they're done with the military, and through TAPS and through, some questionable mentorship, they are told to, put everything on the paper, try to get your VA rating as high as you can. And then, if they decide they want to rejoin in a few years, that information they disclose and the things discovered, CMPs and so forth, could be a barrier to reentry for them. And they could be still great airmen and soldiers.
That's interesting. And then what about the GI Bill? So I'm guessing if I have a active duty service commitment from transferring the GI Bill, for example, that doesn't allow me to go to the Guard. That's a traditional active duty service commitment, or any other GI Bill considerations. Can I still earn that from part-time service in the Air National Guard, for example?
So if you just joined the Guard and you had never been on active duty before, you get what's called Chapter 1606. That's a tax-free stipend paid directly to the member while you're in school. I've been out of recruiting for a little while, so I'm not sure the exact rates off the top of my head, but somewhere around like $400 a month. And that's 36 months. And then let's say you go on active duty and you get, eligibility for Chapter 33 post 9/11. You can combine those to not exceed 48 months total. I always encourage people in the Guard, hey, these are your benefits. Maybe you want to use them. But once you get to that 12-month mark, understand that you could be eating into future entitlement for Chapter 33. And so my own use case, I came in, I had 1606. I deployed for a year. I had back then was called 1607. It was kind of like the precursor to Chapter 33. So that was like a bump up. And then I used many months of that. And so when all was said and done, I think I'd used 37 months total between the two of them. I became an AGR. And now that Title 32 time still may be eligible for Chapter 33, just like Title 10 time does for our active duty service partners. And so now I'm at 100% VA, 100% post 9/11 GI Bill eligibility, but I only have 11 months of entitlement to reach that 48-month cap. And so I immediately transferred it to my wife once we got married and she was in DEERS. And then as soon as my daughters were born, I pulled back 10 months. I gave them each 5, so like many people said before, do the transfer early, get that service obligation done and out of the way, get at least every dependent 1 month, and then you can kind of move things around as you need to. But and again, I've been out of, I used to be a retention officer, and so I dealt a lot more intimately with GI Bill. But at the time, we had people that were transferred from active duty, and they fulfilled that obligation end date in the Air National Guard. So maybe they did 2 years on active duty. The last 2 years they did while they were in Guard. It's a little misleading because it says active duty service commitment, but it is a time service commitment. Even if I never decided that my dependents are going to use it, I got that done and out of the way. And I used to foot stomp that all the time. And every now and then someone would come to see me out process and they were like, hey, yeah, and while I'm here, I want to transfer my benefit to my dependents. I was like, oh, that's great. That means you're going to stick around for another 4 years, right? And there was a few of them that not happy, but they decided it was worth it. And they kicked themselves in the butt, but they decided they're going to stay for another 4 years to get that benefit. But here's one more thing. I feel like Billy Mays, but there's more. If I had a crystal ball back when I was a young airman, I would have not used any of my GI Bill and saved it for my dependents, because in the Guard Reserve, you're going to have access to tuition assistance, and a lot of states, Army and Air National Guards, have access to state benefits. So state of Delaware offers 100% tuition assistance to our Delaware schools. It was a direct payment, and then it was a reimbursement, and now it's moved back to a direct payment. But if I had known what was coming, I would have made the sacrifice and said, hey, I'm not going to spend any more than 12 months of my GI Bill, so that I have the full 36 months to give to my future spouse and children. And I would have been just fine. I would have made it through. If you think about active duty federal TA, there's a lot of stipulations on it. I have access to that now as an AGR. I just haven't utilized it yet. Been pretty busy and then I'll go back to school. those state benefits could be huge. New Jersey National Guard, same thing, 100% to all state schools. I came across a JAG who enlisted in maintenance. He got his undergrad paid for. He got law school at Rutgers paid for, came out with zero student loan debt, all for part-time service. He was never active duty. And if you think about, how many folks come out of law school and they're drowning in, 6 figures of student loan debt, that's a tremendous benefit for members. And, don't just think of the GI Bill as your only avenue and you have to make that decision between, am I going to use it or can I, save some for my kids? I think you had a show where you talked about, sometimes people feel guilt. Like if I use it for myself, I'm taking away from my dependents. Well, if you join the Guard Reserve, you have a separate set of benefits that maybe only you can use and you use those first. And then maybe you don't have to dip into so many of those other benefits that you can share with your spouse and your dependents. And it's really a huge, huge benefit, and just that was always one of the biggest sell points for me when I would try to remotivate people to stay is you got a few more deployments under your belt. You can get that percentage tier up and that's just less money you have to put away for in 529s or UGMAs or, in that college savings fund, whatever flavor you want down the road for your dependents. And then, so again, maybe by virtue of you being in the military, you don't have any student loan debt, but now potentially you can set up that situation for your children as well through your transfer benefits.
Those benefits for the state level seem really awesome. Obviously, they'll vary by state, so each person will have to look into that. What are some other maybe state level benefits for people to ask about as they look at maybe joining the Guard, specifically in the Guard?
So education benefits are the big one, but you'll come across states that they reduce fees to state parks and things like that. They offer state assistance. So we have a system office in the Delaware Guard. It's called DENGREF, and it's like, emergency relief, kind of like similar to what, like Air Force Aid Society, where you got a young airman or soldier, their spouse is deployed, their spouse is back home and the heater blows up. They can petition and get, several $1,000s to get that fixed and things like that. We have, our J9, they offer scholarships to Guard children. And so for me, sending my kids to sports camps and activity camps throughout the summer, they provide a subsidy for that, which is pretty generous. And I'm very appreciative of that. And just a lot of support functions that you would traditionally associate with like a large, robust active duty base. We still do cover down a lot of those things. And the things that we maybe don't have in-house, we do refer, we're tangential to, a lot of other military installations that can provide those services for members as well.
I think there's some states, if they do have state income tax, they may also give a benefit on taxes for Guard pay. Have you seen that before?
I haven't seen it on the basis of Guard membership. I've definitely seen varying states and how they treat military pensions just in general, or if you have, certain levels of VA disability, reductions or elimination of property taxes and things like that. The big one they kind of pull the levers on is, like I said, the education benefits and some, reduced fees when it comes to, state, offices and things like that.
I know there's some challenges of balancing civilian employer and your military duty sometimes. There's also some amazing benefits. Like I know people that still get a 401k match even when they're on active duty orders from their civilian employer. What are some things that people should be watching for as they maybe have a military TSP, a civilian TSP, maybe a 401k from a civilian employer, and how they manage their finances of that complexity?
So the first thing I'll say before I forget is that if you are going to have a civilian career and you are going to keep that military tangential association, you're still going to fall under the, maximum contribution limits. And so if you're under BRS and then your employer also offers a match up to a certain percentage, you're really going to have to kind of map that out. But one thing to kind of be cognizant of is, you want to, Doug Nordham and a couple of guys have talked about on the show, you want to make sure that you're making contributions throughout the entire year. You don't overfund it too early and miss that match on the end. But you have to look at like how you have that set up, because on active duty, it's very predictable. You're going to get the same pay allowances month in, month out. If you are trying to be diligent and you say, well, I'm pulling in $800 a month, for my drill check. And so I'm going to put 100% of that in TSP, and that will get me to X amount. And then I could do the rest of it in, my civilian 401k. Well, what happens if you get put on short notice orders and you don't have enough time to turn that off before your orders start? Well, now your first LES could be, substantially affected by that because, you didn't go in there and change your contribution percentage. You're still set at 100% or 60% or whatever the amount may be, even though now you're working for the military and your compensation can be more or less than what you get on the outside. But now you've made this outside unintended contribution to your TSP, and you're going to have to really manage that to make sure that, it's a good position to be in where you have to be, very diligent about how much you're contributing each month, that you don't go over the limit. But then too, just kind of be aware that you kind of put yourself in a position if you transition from just being kind of part-time military to going to a school, accepting a deployment, doing a temporary AGR tour, something like that. So really, don't just look at what the LES is going to be. Look at how that's going to affect your TSP contribution, because depending on how you have it set up and where you have it coming from, is it special pays, is it bonuses, is it just basic pay? You could end up making a much larger contribution and tie that money up unintentionally. But the other thing too, when balancing the two careers, is the golden goose of double dipping. What I mean to say is most careers, like let's say you work for company A during the day and you work for company B at night, you're moonlighting. Company A is not going to compensate you while you're working for company B, but some companies do for military service. My personal opinion that generally employers are very supportive of the military. We have a lot of protections that you've covered, on the show before. There's actually a website called, I believe it's friendlyforces.com, and it outlines some of these major companies and how long they will either match your compensation or completely pay you what your civilian salary was while you're on active duty for a period of time. And some of them are very, very generous. There's some companies there and some people I've encountered in the Guard and Reserve where, they work for one of these large national companies and they come onto an AGR tour and that company still pays them their full civilian salary for a year on top of their military pay. And then the next year it goes down to they only make up the difference between your basic pay and your civilian pay. And then the next year it's like half that, but it's tremendous. So you might have, a senior airman who worked for one of these companies and he might be pulling in more money than a captain, if you take everything in aggregate. Now, not every company does that. So you kind of have to, suss that out when you're applying for jobs. But for a long time, as a federal technician, you're getting paid according to, a WG or GS schedule. And when I went to schools or deployments or things like that, I had 120 hours of military leave. So I didn't have to take my annual leave time. So I would being paid while I was on orders according to my rank, but I would also get paid for the military leave that I used in my technician position. So those are other things to kind of keep in mind, is that, it's not just I can only get paid by one at any given time. You could be double dipping and stacking that and getting substantially more than what you might have originally anticipated you'd be eligible to earn.
Okay, it looks like that's friendlyforces.org is that website. Seems pretty cool. Thanks for that resource, and we'll put that in the show notes as well. Sam, earlier you mentioned the points thing. It just boggles my mind of how you guys have to track all this. Can you give us a big picture rundown of how people need to understand points if they're going to transition to the Guard?
As I mentioned before, you come into the Guard and from active duty, and you're going to have a points balance where, every day on active duty, you accrued a point. It doesn't mean a whole lot to you while you're in active duty because you're thinking 20 years. I need to get 20 years of total active federal military service to get my retirement, if that's what your goal is. But in the Guard, you're not on active duty all the time. And so there's a variety of ways you can get what I refer to as, your retirement points. If you go into VMPF or whatever your service's point reporting system, you'll see that you can get points for annual tours. So every day of active duty, you get a point for that. You get points for your inactive duty for training. So that's like your drill periods. You get 4 per weekend, 1 for Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, and so forth, a total of 48 a year. You get 15 membership points. Just being in the Guard Reserve and being, a generally satisfactory participant, you get 15 points there. And then you can get points for they call it advanced distributed learning. So let's say you do your PME distance learning, you earn points based on those. They're not really that substantial. I mean, for EJ PME 1 and 2, I got 10 points for one, 11 points for the other. But what you are trying to keep in mind is that you want to get at least 50 points to have a good year. So between your R and R date. So when you initially list it to that, so mine is January 9th. So it's not tied to a calendar year, fiscal year. It's like I joined January 9th, 99. So each year I had to accrue at least 50 points. And so what that does is that builds all these points up so that determines your multiplier when you are eligible for retirement. And so if you have a ton of active duty points, there's a little bit of a boost in that if you get to those 7,300 active duty points and qualify for regular retirement, now they can add back in what's called 1405 time. So that's all the other points that weren't active duty. They can't get you to 20 TAFMs. They can't get you to that 7,300, but they get added on top. So once I get to 20 years TAFMs, my 7,300 active duty points, they're going to add back in almost, I think I have 846 1405 points. And so my multiplier is going to be at 57% of my base pay instead of just regular 50% because I didn't do BRS, it's not 40. There's a variety of ways to collect those points, and that's why people still do, if they're 100% VA and they're still serving, the drill for points only is that they want to get those points up because that increases the multiplier when they go to apply for their pension. And so just kind of keep that in the back of your mind because think about the average experience of I do all my drills, that's 48 points. I'm a participant, that's 15 points. And maybe every couple of years I'll deploy for 6 months or whatever, and then if you're coming from active duty and you've got 6-8 years active duty, you're coming in with a ton of points. And so your retirement, if you transition to Guard Reserve and then that's how you retire, is going to be substantially more than what most of your peers would have by virtue of coming to the Guard with all those points. You don't really lose them, because you left active duty and maybe you're not going to get the regular retirement, immediately upon punching the button. But that's a huge thing to track and kind of play around and kind of help you figure out what you're going to earn in retirement as far as pension.
It's a really important piece to make sure people know that the military, can you still use their experience? And just because you're done, the active duty lifestyle isn't for you or whatever, your spouse wants to settle down, keep their job, you don't like PCSing, you found a really good doctor or school for your kids, like whatever it may be, you can do your exact same job if you want, you can cross-train if you want, you can not move if you want, you can volunteer for deployments or staff tours or whatever if you want. And it gives you a lot of that control back, and it allows the military to retain some of the experience and the investment that they've made in you. It's really nice. And so, Sam, thanks for walking us through some of the financial aspects, some of the retirement, the benefits, education, healthcare, VA disability, how that works, GI Bill, and the state benefits as well. I know your website, as we wrap up, is wecanplanforthat.com. We'll also throw that as well as your LinkedIn link on the show notes, as well as a shout out to the militaryfinancialadvisors.org, MFAA, and the other links we mentioned. Anywhere else you want to point people before we wrap up?
No, I just, I really encourage people that are listening to the show. If things are still confusing to you, reach out to, I really have nothing but the greatest esteem for the other folks in the MFAA. There's all kinds of different advisors there, so you can find a really good fit. Everyone that signs up to have a free consultation with me, I always encourage them, like, hey, schedule a consultation with 2 or 3 other advisors too, because it's really important that you find that right fit and provide you the level of service that you want. I mainly work with kind of like mid or younger career folks, but there's other advisors there that specialize in different niches. And when you're ready to take that next step, it's a great place to find professional advice.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Military Money Manual podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps others find the show, and we really appreciate it. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
The views, opinions, and products discussed in today's episodes are our personal opinions only and do not reflect the Department of Defense, the United States Air Force, the Air National Guard, or the Delaware Air National Guard. This is for information purpose only. Please do your own research and consult your leadership and JAG if you have any questions.